One of the challenges of presenting history to the general public is overcoming long-held beliefs that have been handed down through multiple generations. Stories passed on from parents and grandparents are especially difficult because of the relationship to the storyteller. Correcting these misconceptions can seem offensive to those holding their forefathers' beliefs as the gospel truth, but it is imperative to relate a more accurate picture of history. I'm here at Fort Belknap, where my wife and I serve as director and co-director. Fort Belknap was created as the northernmost fort in a line of forts stretching from the Red River to the Rio Grande in Texas. After Texas annexation, protecting the frontier became the responsibility of the federal government and the United States military. In 1851, Fort Belknap became the most important fort in the state of Texas. Situated on the northwestern frontier, the fort was known for its engagements with the Plain Indians, specifically the Comanche, which are arguably the greatest light cavalry that ever existed. When Fort Belknap was established, it pushed the boundary west. People moved out here thinking they were protected because the soldiers were here, when in fact they were not. The soldiers did not know how to compete, how to fight with the Comanche Indians. Whenever we think of the soldiers at Fort Belknap, we have to think of the Civil War movies we see and what's called Napoleonic warfare or the gentleman's warfare, where you stand in a line and fight. The Comanche Indians didn't fight like that. They had that ambush and attack style that we're more familiar with fighting in war now. And so it was a learning curve whenever the soldiers came out here to compete against the Comanche Indians, to try to run the Indians off of the land, to keep the settlers safe. This fort was officially abandoned in 1867, and residents from the nearby town of Belknap moved into the fort. With the establishment of the salt works in nearby Graham, those settlers living on the fort grounds moved out, and nature took over the old stone buildings. In 1936, as part of FDR's New Deal, the Civilian Conservation Corps, in partnership with the citizens of Young County, decided to reestablish Fort Belknap as a historic park. One of the immediate issues was finding enough stone to restore the dilapidated structure. When the citizens moved away from the fort, they took the stone with them. The CCC put a plan in place to recover the stone and recreate the buildings. And while the cause was noble, this has become problematic in retelling the rich history of the fort. To mark the boundaries of the current fort grounds, the CCC decided to build a short, 3.5-foot rock wall around the perimeter. While the intent was innocent, historical interpretation has proved to be a nightmare. The number one question I'm asked from visitors is, why is the wall so short around Fort Belknap? In most people's minds, forts are supposed to have those high palisaded walls made famous by John Ford and John Wayne in their numerous westerns, or the kinds that you see in the eastern states. But the lack of interpretation since 1936 has led to outrageous stories I find myself trying to correct about why our wall is so short. Oftentimes, these stories, me correcting them, it aggravates the old-timers who swear that their grandfather would never tell them bad information. The most outrageous claim I've heard concerning this rock wall is the wall did not need to be tall because the Comanche were scared to jump rocks. While any reasonable man can see the humor in this claim, this particular gentleman became belligerent whenever I explained the true history of the wall. It seems his grandfather had been pulling his leg when he was out here as a child, and he believed it his entire life. While this is one extreme example, thinking his thought pattern out can prove to be disastrous for a historian working in the public field. Imagine this particular man hearing this story from his grandfather as a child. Any conversation he has about the fort, he relates what his grandfather told him. They tell their friends and so on. Now, I understand this may seem insignificant to many, and most people have never heard of Fort Belknap, much less the wall around it. However, most Americans have heard the story of George Washington cutting down a cherry tree. Simple story, told to children to keep them honest. It's an innocent story, yet has no basis in fact. Or, even better, what about the story of William Barrett Travis at the Alamo? Travis brandishes his sword, tells his men of their peril, and draws a line in the sand, asking those who want to stay and fight to cross the line.
The story goes that all men crossed the line, save for one who was allowed to leave to tell the story. This is an example of a great story with no eyewitness corroboration that has been used in history textbooks. In fact, the first time we see the story published is 50 years after the fall of the Alamo by a person trying to gain fame. Did Travis draw an actual, literal line at the Alamo? Could it have happened? Certainly. Do we have any empirical evidence saying it did? No.
Bringing it back here to Fort Belknap, in 1936, when the CCC came in to restore the fort, their main intent was to put people to work. However, research and planning on the front end of this could have saved misconceptions of historical accuracy and interpretation for perpetuity on the back end, what I'm dealing with right now. One small error, however innocent it may be, has a domino effect.
Currently, no contemporary photographs or drawings of Fort Belknap have been discovered. That's not to say they don't exist, they just haven't been found yet. The only contemporary sketch that exists is a map drawn by Lieutenant Colonel William G. Freeman in 1853 on his inspection tour of what was then known as the 8th Military District. His map and subsequent report was created early in the existence of Fort Belknap and included structures that had been proposed but not yet completed. The absence of any sketches of how the fort looked during its latter years left many in 1936 to believe those buildings had never been completed. This belief is in error, as numerous letters and artifacts have been found proving those structures were in fact completed. Moreover, those buildings reconstructed in 1936 do not resemble the ones originally standing.
Then the question becomes, how do we remedy this situation where you've got history that's been misinterpreted or set vacant for years and years, and you've also got long-held beliefs by the local population and others that things happened a certain way they did, when in fact they did not happen that way. What do we do to fix that? Number one, you've got to have a plan of action. The idea is to understand who your audience is. Here at Fort Belknap, for generations, the better part of half a century, the museum has catered towards local people. Now, the problem with that is usually what happens is you have a parent bringing a child out here because as a child, they were brought out here. And it's a generational thing. So you see these people once every generation. You do have the occasional visitor who comes by every so often, every couple of years, just to kind of see if there's anything new. Now, the problem with that is taking this museum, for instance, for half a century, this museum has sat untouched. Everything that was in here was brought in here whenever they decided to open this museum. 80% of the artifacts in here had nothing to do with Fort Belknap, and a majority of them had nothing even to do with Texas. In fact, we have some artifacts that had nothing to do with the United States. And the problem with that is, what kind of a story are you trying to tell? Here at Fort Belknap, the plan of action that we took was to tell the story of the fort and why the fort matters in the broader scope of American history and Texas history. And so that's what we started with. If you would have come in here in October of 2019, there was nothing that told why the fort was here. There were no military artifacts or anything like that. So I started in 2017 putting a plan of action into place to tell the story that needed to be told. The problem was fundraising. That was the biggest problem I had. Once we got the money to do what we needed to do for the updates and everything, it pretty much fell in place. What would happen is we would do press releases with the newspapers and stuff like that and tell them that we're doing these updates. And what that does is that draws curiosity with the local people. So they'll want to come out here. And that gave me a chance to explain to the local people with those long-held beliefs why these changes needed to be made, why these updates needed to happen. Since October of last year, whenever we started the remodel of this, and as you can see, what we've done is we put this timeline in that starts with before the fort was here, what was here. And then we introduced the fort, why the fort was needed, and then it's a timeline. And so what I've done is I've been able to get some other artifacts to add to our collection that tell the military history. So we've got a timeline that starts with the military history of the fort, and then when the fort closes, it turns into frontier history using the existing artifacts that were in the museum. So you have to be able to put a plan of action in place, and whenever those older people came in with that curious eye, and I was able to talk to them, they understood, yes, this needs to happen. Why hasn't it happened yet? But you still have the few occasional people who hold on to these old, like the gentleman with the short wall. You still have these people who just believe these stories, like Washington cutting down the cherry tree, or William Barrett Travis with the line in the sand. And we present the history to them as we know it with the evidence. And my favorite thing to do is when somebody pushes back on something that I presented, I've always asked them, then show me the evidence and we will change the story if the evidence matches up. Fort Belknap, now we've increased the traffic here, very much so. No longer is this museum just for those generational people. Every day we have people coming in here, most of them from 2-3 hours away that are coming through. Weekends are always extremely busy. During the week is a little bit slower, especially whenever school started. However, the improvements and then the telling the actual story of history has proven to be more entertaining to the visitor. And it's actually been kind of inspiring to watch other people want to start digging into history. Oh, well, I thought this story, my whole life, I believed it this one way. But now you're telling me it's different, and you've got the evidence to show maybe there's some other things that I need to look at. And I really think fundamentally that's what we need to do with history. And so putting a plan of action into place, making sure your plan is known. One of my favorite Bible verses is Habakkuk 2:2. Write the plan clearly so that they that read it can run with it. And I think that's kind of what we tried to do here. Once you write the plan clearly, people understand what you want to do. They get behind you for that.